Hi everyone, welcome to the Coin Republic's Money and Me podcast. I am Varuni Trivedi, your host and the editor in chief of the Coin Republic. And today we have with us a really interesting guest. We have George Kushner, who's the founder of H2crypto with us. It's a really interesting name, H2crypto, and we want to know all about George's journey in the Web3 space as well as how H2crypto came into being. George, if you could take the center stage and let us know what went behind H2 crypto and how's your journey in the Web3 space been till date?
Well, that's a long-winded, or it's a lot of parts for me to unwind. First off, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I love being on podcast and speaking with very interesting people. The story really started going back to 2015. I had worked in TradFi, as the cool kids call it, for quite some time, and done a whole host of things inside of the TradFi world, from institutional fixed income derivative sales to alternative investments to private banking. And in 2015, I was working for BlackRock in Manhattan, and a colleague of mine came up to me and he asked me, so what do you think about Bitcoin? And I know this is a family show, so I'll be a gentleman. I said, I'll tell you exactly what I think about Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's the biggest crock of X that I've ever come across in my entire life. And you can fill in what that X is. Now, why did I say that? I said that because I was a man. I was working on Wall Street. I knew everything about everything. Thankfully, a few years later, I realized actually I didn't know everything about anything, and far from it. And I kept hearing really more and more about blockchain distributed ledger technology. And I wanted to know more about it. I felt like I've been around the markets for a long time, and I had a pretty good foundational basis of econometrics and things like that, as well as the capital markets. And where I started my journey was not trying to understand Bitcoin per se, but I want to understand what is blockchain, what is distributed ledger technology. And I immersed myself in the subject matter, read many books, signed up for every industry email I can get my hands on, met people in the industry. And like many others, I had this aha moment. And if we can get into later what I really think about blockchain and DLT, but when I first tried to set up an account and get involved in crypto myself, I immediately ran into problems. Now, I might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, so they say, but I did used to sell derivatives. And so I figured if this was difficult for me, how's everybody else going to do it? And right then and there, we embarked on trying to create an exchange that from the onset is pretty different than any exchange that's in the world. Most exchanges that are out there are nothing more than really do-it-yourself trading platforms. And for those men and women that can figure it out, fantastic. But if you can't, too bad. So what we try to set up is an exchange that is 24/7, 365 live support for hand-holding, for help, for general crypto know-how, education. And there's a lot more that goes into it. We have a very, very unique and differentiated infrastructure. But you asked about the name, H2crypto. When we set it up, we felt like, what is really the lifeblood of any market? And that actually is liquidity. And so you'll notice in our name, we emphasize the H, the 2, and the O, which obviously represents water on the periodic table. And so water is liquidity. And so we pride ourselves in having some of the deepest liquidity in the industry, hence the name H2crypto.
How does it look on the front end? You said that you guys try to manage to have the deepest liquidity in this space. What does it mean for a customer, George? And how do you guys try to make it happen in the back end for your customers?
Well, what we're trying to do is keep things really simplistic. And we understand that for the newbies, the neophytes, the novices, the beginners, they might not fully understand technical analysis. They're not going to understand what order books look like. So we actually have two user experiences. We have a very easy one-click, simple buy or sell, where clients can push in how much they want to buy or sell. They will get a request for quote that shows what the price is, how much they're paying, and they have about 10 seconds to execute. Very simple. And then for the more sophisticated clients, this gets to your question, we have a pro trader version, and that's where you can do technical analysis. You will see both sides of the order book. We only show, I believe it's about 10 or 11 layers. However, it's deeper than that. And you will see, again, very deep liquidity, tight spreads. And the way we're able to do that is we're pointing to about 30 different global liquidity providers. And those include some of the largest market makers, OTC desks, liquidity pools, and a handful of exchanges. So what you see is a very deep liquid order book that we're super proud of.
Absolutely, I do agree. From when you joined the space, like when you were a big yourself, you mentioned things that you did, and those are in fact things that people tend to do. Or when people ask me for advice, I think those are precisely the things that I tell them: read up more, get connected with the communities, go attend events, talk to more people. So you were absolutely right about how you navigated your way when you entered this space. From then to now, George, how has the narrative changed? Of course, you rightly mentioned that when we sort of came into the space back in 2017, 18, things were a lot difficult. People had to figure out their own way. There were not a lot of helping hands, but that's what you guys are trying to do different with H2 crypto. How has, however, the larger narrative around cryptocurrencies or adoption changed? Not just cryptocurrencies, but DLT, blockchain tech. How has the narrative around it changed in the last half a decade or so, according to you?
Well, I think a couple things. I think one is that most people in the industry don't quite fully understand or appreciate that we really still are a cottage industry. Very, very few people around the world, even still today, own crypto. I see some estimates between 3 and 500 million people, and that's out of 8 billion. So without splitting hairs, 5% of the world owns crypto. Now, what about the other 95%? Quite frankly, again, it's still too clunky, too cumbersome, too difficult. And that's again why we're trying to come in with the hand holding, and that's what people need in this space. They need to feel that they can get a hold of someone, call us, email us, chat with us. It's their hard-earned money. It doesn't go on in the brokerage world. It doesn't go on in the banking world. They can get a hold of their managers, relationship managers, and this needs to happen. There's got to be an ability to trust, and without getting a hold and relying on people and speaking with people, again, whether it's via email or chat or on a telephone call, it's very difficult to trust someone. I think that what you're seeing is that the crypto space, it is evolving, albeit at a very, very slow pace. And again, we can talk about internet adoption back in the late 90s and early 2000s before it totally took off and proliferated. I think you're going to see that here. We are seeing baby steps. I think the first kind of crack in the armor was what happened just a few months back with the Bitcoin ETF. This allowed I look at it as a Bitcoin with training wheels. It's an easier way for people that don't have to worry about setting up an account on exchange and trying to understand what cold storage is versus hot wallets and things of that nature. It's also an easier way for people to gain exposure, albeit to me, they're losing the utility of Bitcoin by going into an ETF. It's excellent for price appreciation or depreciation, as we're seeing now with a lot of selling coming out of the ETFs. But I think as more and more cryptocurrencies become exchange traded funds, you will see more and more people. And I think, as I mentioned, I think that's going to be maybe the training wheel for people to get into the industry, kind of get their toes wet, and then they'll kind of morph into owning Bitcoin outright. I think the real hindrance continues to be the regulatory lack of clarity around the world, especially right here in the United States. I think that once regulatory clarity takes hold, hopefully in 2025, I'm thinking maybe by the back half of 2025, that's when you're going to see a mass amount of institutional adoption coming into the space. And then I think retail will continue to plow in shortly thereafter. No asset really goes up like this in perpetuity. Crypto obviously is a very, very volatile asset. I think that right now, everybody's kind of sitting back and seeing what's going on from a regulatory standpoint. And again, once that clarity takes hold, I think we're going to see more and more mass adoption come in. And education is a huge component of it.
Of course, education has to be one of the biggest components of adoption, mass adoption going forward. But when we talk about some challenges, and of course, as an enterprise, you would advocate more adoption, especially for retailers. Is it happening at the moment? Is the volatility factor still making Bitcoin a not as great investment option? You did mention that ETFs have changed the narrative a little bit for a lot of retailers who were scared to get out in the market, even from a regulatory perspective, you rightly said. But we're still not there in terms of the kind of adoption that we that we see or that we foresee for the market or Bitcoin, even in terms of seeing Bitcoin as an investment option or the digital gold that we deem Bitcoin as every now and then? How far do you think we are from that narrative of Bitcoin being seen as a key long term investment or digital gold holding up? And what do you think would be some of the biggest roadblocks? You obviously briefly touched upon regulation and education. Other than that, in terms of getting more retailers, more people from lower income strata into this particular investment stream, what do you think is the major roadblock that we still have?
Well, I think Bitcoin obviously is a very, very unique currency. I personally label Bitcoin a commodity. And you're like, what's a commodity? Well, it sounds just like it is. It's a part commodity and part currency. As we know, it can be used as a store of value. It has a finite supply, and it acts as an inflation hedge because we have this finite supply. I've been hearing about peak oil and peak gold my whole career on Wall Street, and yet they keep drilling for oil and hitting it, and they keep panning for gold, and they keep mining it. With Bitcoin, we know at 21 million in 2140, that's it. It's done. So there are very, very different and unique characterizations and aspects of it. I personally don't want to use it as a currency because I want to hold it. I'm a very, very long-term investor, and I think Bitcoin continues to appreciate. This is not investment advice. This is just my personal, humble opinion. I believe as more and more people find out about it, as the institutional players come into the space, they too will look at it as this kind of commodity. I think that the biggest hindrance from Bitcoin being as the currency standpoint gets down to the transaction speed and how it can handle the transactions on the blockchain. I personally, and we're starting to see a lot more interest from kind of B2B players and B2B2C players in stable coins. And as a retailer, that to me makes a lot more sense than using Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency that has more volatility. Because the reality is, if you're a retailer, you don't want to sell something for $100, and by the time you receive it, it could be down to 90 or 85. So if you have a stable coin, then that certainly mitigates the problem of the volatility of the underlying cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is, as I view it, kind of a commodity. It's part commodity, part
Right.
currency. The currency component, because you can use it to buy goods and services. The commodity component is because it's an inflation hedge. We know the halving happens every 4 and change years. There's a finite supply, and people will come to that, I think, as opposed to maybe gold over time, just because of its sheer finite supply. You know, we've been hearing for decades about gold and oil having peak gold and peak oil, yet they keep drilling and hitting oil and they keep mining for gold and finding that as well. With Bitcoin, we know 21 million, 2140, that's it. I think for retailers, and we're starting to get a lot more interest from B2B players and B2B2C players, and this makes a lot more sense, where they don't want to take Bitcoin or ETH per se, but they want to take stable coins because they don't want to sell something for, let's just say, $100. And by the time it arrives to them, it's 92 or 95 or 96. With stablecoin, they don't have to worry about this volatility, and they know that they're going to get, for the most part, one for $1. And that's where we're seeing a big pickup in retailers and other types of people that want to use crypto with their clientele, as opposed to maybe using, you know, a more volatile coin like Bitcoin or Ether.
What are your current thoughts on the state of the market? Of course, in terms of volatility, we're not seeing a lot of volatile swings. However, there is, and we don't like to talk a lot about price action per se, but so much of what happens in the market is driven or governed by Bitcoin's price specifically. Where do you think we stand in terms of price action? There is, of course, the post ETF hype has sort of died down now. We're looking at another Ethereum ETF sometime in the near future, but that too has some time to play out, I feel. Where do you stand? Where do you see the market standing at the moment, and where do you see the market evolving from here? Any great expectations for the last quarter of this year?
year because a lot of people are expecting some great moves. Of course, it's too soon to say, but what would you foresee happening in the near future?
Well, here's what I would say. I would say, again, I'm a long-term investor in good quality kind of blue chip projects, and I'm incredibly bullish on the long term. I think it's super hard to predict interim volatility. However, we can go off what we know sitting here right now today. And so right now today, we're seeing a pretty much good amount of pressure started by Bitcoin, and then all of the other blue chips and altcoins are following suit. And what's going on right now is very easy. It's all a supply driven issue. You have the German government that confiscated a tremendous amount of Bitcoin. They're selling. You see the Mt. Gox coin is finally starting to come offline in July. So the holders who haven't been able to touch this stuff since 2014 are getting their hands on it. And then you have ETF selling pressure. So these three drivers right now are what's pushing crypto prices down. Long term, end of year, I think crypto is significantly higher than where we are today. I don't want to put a number on it because I don't have that crystal ball, but I do think it will be significantly higher. Long term, again, there's very little doubt in my mind that the blue chip coins are going to be higher. The thing about crypto is, there are 20, 30,000 different coins out there. And the majority of these projects will absolutely fail. They'll go to zero. It's going to be very similar to the tech wreck of 2000, 2001, 99. But I think that investors have to do their due diligence, just like they do when they're investing in a stock, bond, commodity, or currency. And they have to make sure that they're investing in a project that has scalability and growth potential and a good, real team behind them. So I'm very, very bullish. I think the ETFs, I'm not a huge fan of the structure in crypto for ETF, but I do think it's going to be good for price action because, again, I think it's going to be this crypto on training wheels for a lot of investors to get in and out, liquid, don't have to worry about the wallets and cold storage and things like that I mentioned a few minutes ago. I think the ETH ETF will definitely be this year. And I think there'll probably be other ETFs coming down the line, whether it's Solana or DOT or many, many other cryptocurrencies that will probably turn into ETFs as well.
Despite all the enthusiasm, despite insiders still being a tad bit more bullish around the sector, there are still a lot of regulatory concerns. We initially spoke about how the regulatory landscape doesn't offer as much clarity as entrepreneurs would seek or as investors or traders would seek from governments, not just in the US, but I feel globally. If you could give your brief overview of the global regulatory landscape in terms of cryptocurrencies, blockchain based projects or products, which are some of the key geographies, specifically if we look at the regulatory landscape or in terms of compliance, what would be some of the geographies that would really develop their economies basis this wave of emerging tech that we're seeing in the market? What would your topics, so to say, be?
I think three geographies jump out at me, and unfortunately, the United States is not one of them. And if the United States is not careful, they're going to be totally disintermediated when it comes to crypto and blockchain, which is an interesting thing. But, Europe, let's start with Europe and MiCA. I think that's going to really help settle things. And again, right now, it's very hard to operate not knowing 100% clarity of where the regulatory environment is. So MiCA in Europe is going to be a big one. I believe the UAE and what's going on in Dubai, that's probably the second. And then shortly they're followed by Singapore. And what these three jurisdictions are doing, instead of fighting it and opposing it, they're embracing it. If you think about digital currencies, it's nothing more than the next evolution of currencies. This has been evolving for 6,000 years, starting with bartering. And then we went to, gold and the shekel, then gold and silver. And then we went to paper money, then the credit card. So this is nothing more than next evolution. And I think that these jurisdictions understand it. The other thing about these jurisdictions, they might understand a little bit more than the United States, although this next statement is going to be a little bit contradictory of what I just said, is that globally, even here in the US, we have 20% of the world that's unbanked or underbanked. However, for whatever reason, it maybe doesn't feel as pervasive here in the US and some of those other jurisdictions that I mentioned. And so people that have been totally locked out of the banking since the dawning of man, they now have an opportunity, because although, again, 1 in 5 are unbanked, over 80% have one of these. And if you have one of these, you can now virtually become your own bank. Do I think the United States gets its stuff together and gets up the curve rather quickly? I really, really do. I think that's going to be, like I mentioned, a 2025 event. We obviously have an election here coming up in November, and that could be a big determining factor of where the U.S. heads with crypto. And then also Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, he's got a term that expires, I believe, in 2026. So even if he continues with his staunch opposition, that would go away in the next, call it 1 to 2 years.
Expectations from the post-election result scenario? Do you think it's going to be in favor of development of these techs, or will it go against it? Of course, this isn't, we're not asking you for any predictions, but what would you hope for more as an insider in the crypto space?
Look, right now, I think that both of the candidates here in the U.S. are trying to get elected, and they're pretty much saying whatever they have to say to try and get elected by their constituents. I think that ultimately, I don't know really what the vested interest is between both candidates. I will tell you that the good news is more and more congressmen and women here in the United States are getting up the crypto curve. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it is, again, I cannot stress enough, when you have a relatively new technology, even though we're talking about something that's been around for quite some time, but people have not really paid attention to it until very recently. Most adults shun, and they don't really want to embrace changes. But again, it's hard to fight this behemoth that's now out of the box, and it's not going back in the box anytime soon. And so I think if you get an administration that, if nothing else, is at least open to listen and learn, then that's where we have to start. And as I mentioned, I think we have enough men and women in Congress. And again, every single day, I think a few more start to listen up and perk up. And that's what's really going to be a big driver right now. I know former President Trump is now speaking about, he would be a crypto president. I know before he wasn't a big crypto guy. And Biden, he seems to be a little bit more anti. I think ultimately, whoever becomes president, they're going to have to embrace it, because, every major central bank in the world, including the United States, is looking at a CBDC. And so if you're looking at a CBDC, then we can do the math and know what's eventually coming down the pike. So I don't really have a, quote, dog in the fight, just because I know how politics work, and they're going to say whatever they can say to get elected. And once they're in, they might not really fulfill what these earlier campaign promises were. That's why I'm really more relying on more men and women in Congress and hopefully Senate to start to embrace crypto, where we can start to formulate some regulatory guidelines and get these enacted.
Right. Are there any big plans for H2crypto this year? Any big announcements that you guys are coming, that you guys are looking at, or any big acquisitions? Also, if you could talk a little bit in terms of your user acquisition, where are your users placed? How have they grown in the last couple of years? We've, of course, seen a rather bearish wave in the market, but has that deterred users? Has user acquisition been on point despite the bearish wave or the large narrative that we saw in the last couple of years? How's it been for H2crypto at large?
I will tell you that this past winter was absolutely brutal. I think that when you look at the initiation of when it began was sometime in the spring of 2022. We had the collapsing of Terra Luna, and that set off a cascade of a lot of failures, from BlockFi to Voyager to Celsius. And then we know what happened in the fall of 2022 with FTX. And so for a young startup like us, just to kind of survive these almost 2 years has been a bit miraculous. And when we launched this exchange, I touched on this at the beginning, but I didn't really go into too much detail. With my very heavy background on Wall Street, I was pretty familiar of how infrastructure of Wall Street works and what goes on in trading. When I came into the Web3 world, I was kind of surprised at what's happening. And one of the biggest things that shocked me was, again, this lack of support and service and the ghosting that happens. It happens to me, happens to clients throughout the world. The other thing that we try to do is we have set up an infrastructure that is extraordinarily, we have partnered with a United States chartered trust company. And this US chartered trust company actually custodies all of our clients' fund, whether it's crypto or fiat. And so when a client onboards with us, all of their assets goes over here into segregated accounts. So we actually have zero access to client funds, and that makes us very, very unique. The fiat is held in a couple banks around the United States, and then the crypto is held in cold storage till it needs to be put online to effectuate movement. And I think moving forward, that this is going to be a model that other firms might look to, because what we are trying to do is have the same alignment of client interest. And even though we mentioned we have this great liquidity, we don't have an internal trading desk. So we can't front run our client orders. We can't trade against them. We can't rehypothecate their tokens and lend it out to hedge funds and get paid and not pay them. So our model, again, is super, super unique. Because of our alliance and partnership with this U.S. chartered trust company, that allows our jurisdictional footprint to follow theirs, because again, our hands are never on the money. So currently we have 38 of the 50 states here in the U.S. and around 70 countries around the world that we can go into. I can tell you that our exchange is pretty heavy U.S. centric, but that being said, every day we're speaking with clients and trying to do partnerships with people all around the world, whether that's Western Europe, whether that's LATAM, part of Asia, even certain pockets of MENA we're allowed to go into as well. I think that just now, again, the crypto winter, it's been very, very tough. I will tell you that I think the catalyst to kind of start thawing things out happened with the Bitcoin ETF back in, I believe it was February of this year. I think as more and more people come into the market, we're going to continue to see this thawing, but I do see the ice is finally starting to melt. A lot of people have survived. And I think that there are areas around the world, the Turkey and the Philippines, and again, Latin America, where crypto is going to be very, very prominent. And I firmly believe that crypto will be as ubiquitous and a part of people's portfolios. This might be a little bit aggressive, somewhere between 3 to 5 years from now, as stocks, bonds, commodities, and currencies. I think it's going to be that prevalent. It might not be the percentage, but everybody is going to, or most people have exposure to cryptocurrencies.
Absolutely. When we talk about exposure, a lot of beginners in this space or noobs in this space are scared of the scams, the hacks, the endless amount of news that we see on the bad actors that operate in the crypto Web3 space. And I feel like that deters users a lot. How are you guys positioned differently when it comes to securing users? And what do you think is one way out for the industry or sector at large in terms of dealing with these bad actors, scams, hacks? Of course, education, I feel, plays a huge role into protecting oneself from these bad actors. But other than that, as enterprises, what do exchanges or what do traders do to protect themselves from such situations?
Well, I think, again, you hit the nail on the head. I think that you have to educate yourself. And even once you're really educated and know what's going on, I will speak to and come across very seasoned people in this industry that they themselves have been scammed. And so it is a very treacherous space right now. I think that ultimately, if you're a cryptocurrency owner, even though we have the utmost faith and security in our exchange, and as I mentioned, the predominance of our cryptocurrency for our users are held in cold storage, but they themselves have the right to take it offline and put it on their own cold storage device. And I think ultimately that's what clients should do. Now, how many exchanges tell you that? Not many, because a lot of them are rehypothecating their clients' securities and their tokens, and I shouldn't say securities, tokens and coins, but for us, we're not doing that. So it's not in our vested interest to have them save it. I think, but that too comes with certain liabilities. If you forget your keys and you forget your password, then you might as well not have it. So there is no true fail-safe, but I do think that is a very good one for the industrial complex, for the enterprise complex. Again, same thing. I think that probably cold storage is the best for them. And if they're uncomfortable, again, we help walk them through how to do it from user setup. And I think ultimately that's what most people want. It's one thing to sign up for an account with a major exchange as a new person. And I'm not knocking them, it's just their business model. They do not emphasize client service. And what I would argue is in any type of financial institution where you are taking people's money, that's where it all starts and ends. You have to have client support. And we absolutely pride ourselves on that. That's one of the main things we emphasize in addition to the infrastructure that's very, very unique. So for our clients, and you're right, that is a major complexity in being scared. Those are the major two hindrances of why there's only 400 or 500 million out of 8 billion that are even using this stuff. And so for a client to be able to pick up the phone and call us and talk to us about it, or chat with us, or email, or drop a support ticket, it gives them reassurance that, hey, there actually are men and women here. I'm not just speaking to some bot. I'm not going to be ghosted for weeks on end, or months, or maybe never. I mean, when I first signed up for an exchange and ran into issues, didn't know what I was doing, this was 7 years ago. And guess what? I'm still waiting on my reply email. And as we started doing due diligence, we found out that this is par for the course. I mean, it's just not something that's emphasized. And I think people don't want that. I think it's one thing if you're buying a hat online and you can't get a hold of the people or something, but when you're giving your hard-earned money to a trusted institution, there's got to be a component of accountability, and that's what we're trying to bring to the market.
Absolutely. Some really great stuff that's happening at H2cryptO, without a doubt. I'm finally coming to my last question of this interview, and thank you so much for bearing with us, George. You've had your own journey from a non-believer to a believer. How has that panned out for you? And what were if you have to advise someone, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice to a beginner in the crypto space as to how they navigate better in this space?
I think that it starts with being open-minded. I think, unfortunately, as we age as adults, we seem to know everything about everything, especially if you're working in certain industries where, unfortunately, arrogance is very, very prominent. But I think if you're willing to listen and learn, that's what you do. And I think there are so many free publications and periodicals that are out there where people can start getting up to speed with signing up for certain emails. There are a lot of places on the internet. You can go to YouTube and find some videos. Just make sure they're good sources and reliable sources. How do you do that? By seeing how many people are out there watching them and look at their reviews, because again, there are a lot of scammers out there. I think as I'm watching through my lens, watching this world evolve, I am super excited about the broad-based applicability of blockchain and where it's going. For whatever reason, it initially globbed on into financial services. But I think about other industries like healthcare, like logistics, law, medicine, real estate, personal records. There's no doubt in my mind that everyone's health records, their driver's license, their birth certificate, their passport, these are all going to be probably as an NFT on the blockchain. And when you think again about the broad place applicability, real estate, tokenization. If somebody wants to sell a building right now, he or she pretty much needs to sell the entire building. With tokenization, you can sell certain floors or certain offices, and that's going to change the world. From a liquidity standpoint, it's going to be, again, a game changer. And there's so many different industries that this is going to apply. Again, I think financial services, the initial kind of litmus test, if you will, and then you're going to see other industries, and they already are very slowly adopt it and grow it. And this conversation will look archaic in a few years from now because it's going to be so prevalent, I think, across society.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And finally, what are your expectations from the crypto space in the next year or the next year end? What are you expecting in the next couple of years? How will the narrative change? Are you expecting any big emerging techs to take over, any big emerging technologies to take over? Of course, we have not seen the full strength of AI or DLT as of now, even. So, do you see these technologies developing into something bigger than what they are at the moment? And what trends in terms of emerging technologies are you particularly eyeing or interesting that you find interesting at the moment?
I think that layer 0, which I guess is considered the hardware, the internet, the connectivity, that I believe is going to change dramatically. I think that there are a lot of very, very smart people that are eyeing this space very closely. Again, for whatever reason, a lot of people haven't immersed themselves in it yet. I shouldn't say for whatever reason. Again, I think it gets down to clarity, regulatory clarity, because people don't want to quit certain jobs going in an industry that might have a cloud or question mark or some type of suspicion on it. That being said, again, I think layer zero is going to improve dramatically. I think the things that we're talking about today, the OG blockchains, Bitcoin and Ether, all these things down the road, they might be considered relics down the road, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. But right now, this is where we stand. I think that looking out, and what I'm about to mention, these are no real new chains, but I think Solana, obviously, for its very high throughput, its low cost, its growing ecosystem, and then you look at things like Polkadot, due to its interoperability with other blockchains and its also scalability. And then you have Elrond, which is something I recently came across. It's got incredible speed and efficiency, and it's very scalable for decentralized apps. And so I think as more broad-based applicability gets applied into blockchains, they're going to be newer and newer technologies. I mean, smart contracts, I think we have absolutely nicked the tippy top of the iceberg. I think people don't understand how this can effectuate and be a game changer in law. Think about law and smart contracts. I mean, I'm not trying to get lawyers out of their profession, but I think from an efficiency standpoint, smart contracts are going to change. And in business contracts, smart contracts will be an absolute game changer. So I think there does have to be a pickup in speed, a pickup in efficiency and transaction, which it is growing every day with new blockchains and different blockchains. Hedera is a great one for enterprise. And I think, again, there's so many things out there that we don't even know about. But once this regulatory clarity clicks in, and I keep saying that over and over and over, I do think you're going to see mass entrance. And I also think you'll see mass acquisition come in, because I think you have a lot of businesses, whether they're TradFi companies or just regular B2B businesses, that are really eyeing this space. And they haven't made a move yet, but we start to see a little bit of M&A activity in the Web3 space. And I think that becomes more and more prevalent down the road as the landscape becomes more clear.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today, George. This was a great chat with you, and I totally agree in the shared vision of more adoption, of course, mass adoption and mass acquisition for the space at large. And here's to, I feel more optimism for not just how we're going to see the regulatory landscape change, but also more emphasis on education for anyone who's entering this space. And thank you so much for highlighting all of those key points today for our viewers. And once again, I would love to thank you as well as your team and our team for making this possible. And big shout out to you, George, for joining us today, as well as to H2cryptO. And I urge all our viewers to check out George and H2cryptO.